Happy snow day, or I should say sleet day, not a very attractive day outside. But the reality of our schedule is don't really have time just to say, well, we'll get back to this stuff. So I'm going to do a web lecture of a couple of videos that you can obviously you found on YouTube, and you'll see a couple other segments. Today we're going to be talking about mergers and acquisition strategy, and you can see my little title at the bottom of the screen, which is this is the M&As are the sport of kings and queens. This is the sexy stuff that makes the Wall Street Journal. It's big, it's dramatic. You're going to find it doesn't work well in a lot of cases, but nonetheless, companies are very active in pursuing mergers and acquisition strategies. And here's basically how we're going to frame today's discussion. We're going to talk about why they do it, how they do it, and then why it does and does not work very well. And then we're going to close with the flip side of M&A strategy, which are restructuring strategies, which usually include snipping parts of the company away. So it's like the opposite of mergers and acquisitions. Couple of basics. A merger is usually a misused term. You'll hear them talking about companies merging when really it's an acquisition. And here's the way to think of it. A merger is on a relatively equal basis where both parties are basically the same size, and they come into it as a marriage of equals, so to speak. As opposed to an acquisition, there's usually an acquiring firm and a target firm. They don't have to be opposite sides, but there's no lack of clarity in the issue of who's going to dominate or who is the person calling the shots. That is the acquirer, and the target is, I don't want to say the victim, but they're the ones that are just swept along for the ride. The other term that you'll sometimes hear is this idea of a takeover, or it's usually referred to as a hostile takeover, and that's simply when the advance is unwelcome. And you're going to see me use in the process of this lecture a little bit of dating and marriage lexicon. So a hostile takeover is like when the guy or the gal really doesn't want to go out with a partner, but for whatever reason, like their parents are making them or something like that, it's a little bit of an arranged marriage. The approach is unwelcome, but nonetheless, the approach comes. So how well does it work? The textbook does a really nice job of putting it right up front that says, realistically, very few mergers and acquisitions seem to accomplish the goals they set out for. And again, the point isn't, well, does that mean that M&As are good or bad? The point is that if you don't do it well, chances are you're not going to have any success. And in fact, you will often harm your company by doing a poorly framed or poorly executed M&A. On this slide is a lot of, but by no means all, of some high-profile M&As that have occurred through the years. I'm probably in future years going to take off the AOL Time Warner because that so predates all of you, but that will probably go down as the worst M&A in all of history. And the reason it still bears a little bit of mention is it's the M&A that had the greatest promise. This was in the early days of the internet, and AOL at that time was the leading portal onto the internet. And so then you have the leading portal onto the internet joining up with a leading content provider. That would be Time Warner and all the TV shows and movies in its library. So this idea of the leading portal with great content seems to be a marriage made in heaven. It absolutely failed for any number of reasons, many of which we're going to talk about today. So that shows you the promise, but then the often failure that goes with M&As. What I'd like you to do is just briefly scan these, note them, and then I'm going to ask you to come back to them because you're going to see me reference some of them as we go. So on to the basics. This is the one part that I really want you to pay attention to simply because it's very different than the way the textbook describes it. I'm not at all suggesting that the textbook is wrong. What I'm telling you is I'm going to describe things a little bit differently than the textbook does, and I think it's going to help you. So I'm going to say that there are basically three types of mergers and acquisitions, or three major categories. And the fact that you recognize that there are three main types, which is to say they are not all alike, is actually pretty important in understanding whether they're likely to work or not. The first is a merger and acquisition is a consolidation. This is when you take entities that basically look like each other and you mash them all together into one. The dominant logics for this is often cost savings and market power, and I've got a great M&A from the previous page to illustrate to that. The next is M&As as an extension. In other words, M&As is consolidation. We're all about trying to get together and get big. M&A as an extension is we're trying to grow a little bit. And that grow can, the two most common manifestations of that are grow into a new product lineup or grow into a new geographic region. And sometimes there's a little bit of both going on. And I don't want to portray these three buckets as independent. You're going to see that a particular M&A was maybe largely this type, but a little bit of this going on as well. And that's just the way it is in real business. The third is the hardest one to identify because they're the ones that typically don't get noticed, and that's M&As as entrepreneurship. So this is where you take an M&A as an extension, but now you induce a lot of risk into it because you're going into a very unproven market. You're trying to take two things and combine them and create something very new out of that combination. So this is the one that is kind of the hardest to get our mind around, but it's also the one that potentially has the greatest promise of long-term success and growth. So the first one we're going to introduce on this particular video clip is M&As as consolidation. The two ways to look at it is horizontal. This is when you take two companies that basically look like peers or rivals and you put them together. Vertical, where you go and buy someone in your chain, whether you buy a supplier or whether you integrate forward into the buyer. So this was an example of the Tiffany's, the diamond mine, where Tiffany's, the diamond company, buys a diamond mine. That would be an M&A for consolidation. And then the textbook talks about related, where you bring something in that isn't quite like you, but it makes good sense. And this would be, for example, if an automaker bought XM Sirius radio, since they tend to be the major sellers of XM Sirius. The key thing about M&As as consolidation is the two economic rationales are cost savings. In other words, this thing's going to work because we're going to be able to take out a lot of the cost. And usually that cost is taken out in the form of personnel reductions. You just find that you can consolidate a lot of back office functions in particular, and you save money. The other part of it, though, is just flat market power, where through becoming bigger, you control a bigger share of the market, you have more economies of scale, you are able to dominate better terms with your suppliers or with your buyers, and you just come out of this looking stronger. A great example of that, if you noticed, well, I'm going to pause for just a second, hit pause on the video, and I want you to go look at that list of M&As I gave you, and I want you to look at which ones of those you would define as M&As for consolidation. So hit pause and then come back to me. Well, I'm glad you came back and didn't take a nap instead. There are several examples of M&As for consolidation. ExxonMobil was a great consolidation M&A. Adidas and Reebok, a consolidation M&A. But the ones, if you noticed, a lot of airlines, really most of the major airlines in the United States have gone through some layers of consolidation. One of the ones that's achieved the greatest results has been the merger of, and it really was kind of a merger, although it was dominated by Delta and what was Northwest Airlines. There was a little bit of extension going on because Northwest was bigger in the Pacific than Delta was, whereas Delta was bigger in Europe and in South America. But it just brought them a lot of market power. So if you look at the downsizing effect, you can know that they were able to take out a lot of cost in the marketing functions and the basic headquarters functions because a lot of those entities got consolidated. You could take 3 people that were working a given task and combine them into 2 because now you're only running 1 airline. But they also got market power. And by that, they had certain markets where they became to dominate those markets, and it does affect pricing. Now, the Federal Trade Commission looks at this, but it's almost inevitable that things like that are going to happen, that they're going to get some market power. And so the Delta Northwest would be clearly one of those acquisitions that we would put down into the successful category because it's performing very well. I'm going to stop now. Join me on the next videotape so we can talk about M&As as extensions.